Please join me in prayer. Open our eyes that we might see the wonders of your grace all around us. Amen. It's now a few days after Christmas Day, and I wonder how many of us have already had to return or exchange gifts. The shirt was the wrong color, the sweater was the wrong size, the toy was missing parts, the knife set or the book was a duplicate, etc., etc. It's one of the ironies of gift giving at Christmas that after weeks of shopping, we end up having to return or exchange some of the gifts. A few years ago, I resolved that one of the gifts I would give to my extended family is a gift I know they won't want to return or exchange, or at least that's what I tell myself. One gift I give everyone, my brothers and their wives, my nieces and nephew, is warm socks. My parents are getting them this year too, and they're tuning in this morning. So, Mom and Dad, the socks are in the mail. They all live in cold weather climates, and no one wants cold feet. While giving the same thing each year might seem repetitive, I justify my gift by saying to myself, you can't have enough warm socks. Plus, I kind of like the idea that I'm identified in the family as the one who gives socks each year. Last week, the New York Times asked its readers about the most memorable gifts they've ever received. Hundreds of responses came in, and shockingly, no one mentioned socks. Among the many responses, the Times focused on a few in particular. What struck me about these most memorable gifts is how thoughtful and humble they are. Here are a few. Tade from Virginia Beach recalled a gift she received at Christmas in 1996. Her husband was deployed overseas, and she was feeling overwhelmed as a working mother with 3 young kids, 2 of them still in diapers. She told a friend that she couldn't imagine getting a Christmas tree, strapping it to her car, putting it up, and decorating it by herself with 3 little kids underfoot. One night, a few weeks later, she heard a knock at the door. There stood her friend with a fully decorated Christmas tree. "Where do you want it?" her friend asked. And 30 years later, Tade says she will never forget that gift. Rose Marie from Charlottesville, Virginia, remembered a gift her husband gave to her many years ago. He gave her, in her words, a regular, normal stapler. He noticed, she said, that I would run upstairs to my home office when I needed to staple something, and he felt I shouldn't have to do that. Today we live in a different house, but my home office is still upstairs, and that stapler is always handy on the first floor. I was touched that even after so many years together, my husband was devoted to making my life better. Karen from Boston said that when she was in her 20s, she asked her father to record himself reading her favorite children's books as a Christmas present. She wrote, "I wanted to make sure that my kids would be able to enjoy his storytelling abilities as much as I had, even if he wasn't around anymore by the time they were born. My father is an expert storyteller. He does all the voices and sound effects. My father is still alive," said Karen, "and now my son is almost old enough to appreciate being read to in person. But I still have the recording, and it brings me joy to know my father's voice will be preserved for generations to come." Mary from Alexandria, Virginia, said that when her daughters were ages 7 and 9, she told them a couple of times as she served them spaghetti, "I'd really like a pasta spoon." "I was a teacher and a single mother," said Mary, "and a pasta spoon was not something we truly needed. But on Christmas Day, I unwrapped a homemade pasta spoon from my daughters. They'd broken the metal heads off 2 hangers and glue-gunned them to a wooden spatula. Then they decorated it with markers and added a few plastic beads. My first reaction was alarm at realizing they knew where I kept the glue gun. Then I was flooded with so much love. I explained that while we couldn't use this spoon for pasta, it was clearly a work of art and engineering. We would display it in the glass case with our pictures and other treasures. It's been 11 years, and this is still the most precious gift I've ever gotten. And finally, Sherry from Clifton Park, New York, said that she remembered every year before Christmas when she and her siblings were kids, her dad would go to the library and carefully pick out books for each of them. He wrapped them up as presents, and in the days leading up to Christmas, let them open a book a day. We loved having special books picked out for us, said Sherry. It kept us busy reading while our parents were preparing for the holidays. And then after the holidays, when we were done reading, my dad returned the books. Notice how thoughtful and humble these gifts are. A Christmas tree for a frazzled friend, a regular old stapler, recording a father's storytelling voice, a homemade pasta spoon, specially selected library books. In a way, these humble gifts connect with the theological core of Christmas. Amid all the glitz and gloriousness of Christmas, the lights, food, carols, joy, excitement, and celebration, the story itself is a story of humility. In one of his letters, St. Paul wrote about the humble theological underpinnings of Christmas when he said that even though the heavenly Christ was in the form of God, he did not cling to being on equal terms with God, but emptied himself to be born in human likeness. Christ humbled himself, says Paul. The humility of being emptied of heavenly glory, to be clothed with flesh at Christmas, is a humility Christ carried throughout his adult ministry. He once said, "Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." The night before the cross, he modeled this humility by taking a basin of water, stooping down and washing the feet of his disciples, even Judas's feet, as an example of humble, servant-like love. And then, of course, the cross itself was the humblest of humble acts. Christ's humility made humility one of the most important virtues for Christians down through the ages. New Testament writers said of humility that we're to clothe ourselves with humility, that God gives special grace to those who are humble, that God exalts the humble, that in humility we're to consider others as more significant than ourselves, looking not to our own interests but to the interests of others, that we're not to think of ourselves as better than someone else, and on it goes. Theologians in Christian history took the example of Christ's humility and the teaching of New Testament writers about humility and expanded on it. St. Bonaventure in the 13th century, for example, taught that to work up to loving God, we should start by loving the very humblest and simplest things. He wrote that to get to the point of loving God and loving neighbor, it's good to start low. Start, he said, by loving the humble rocks and elements, then move to trees, then animals, and then humans. Angels will soon seem like a real possibility, and God is then just a short leap away. When thinking about humility, from the humility of Christ at Christmas and of Christ on the cross, to the humility spoken of in the New Testament, to the ladder of love that rises from loving the humblest elements all the way up to the angels and then to God, when thinking about Christian humility, it's easy to mistake this virtue for groveling, for being overly apologetic and mousy, lacking confidence or courage or a backbone. But none of this is humility. Rather, Humility, as C.S. Lewis once put it, is having a realistic sense of who we are before God and others, not thinking too highly or too lowly of ourselves, but being honest and realistic. Pride, the opposite of humility, he said, exalts itself, but it's based on a fragility of the soul. Pride needs to have a lofty view of itself, or to lash out when it feels attacked, or to think the other is always the problem because the sense of self is so insecure. But humility comes from a place of stability. It doesn't need people's approval or to reply in kind to rudeness or insults. True humility doesn't need to prove itself or jockey for position or get its ego fed in the same way that pride does. Writer John Pavlovitz once told a story that illustrates the internal battle we sometimes face between pride and humility. A few years ago, he said, I was in line at a local quick-serve Mexican restaurant when I noticed a mom from our neighborhood standing with her 2 sons just behind me. We'd never met, but I knew through mutual friends that she was single and that she'd seen a good deal of adversity since immigrating to America from Croatia a few years earlier. Seeing her with her kids, knowing the stress she was under, I decided to secretly pay for her meals along with mine. I told the cashier my plan, and after paying, I quickly retreated to a table across the restaurant and watched the woman react with giddy disbelief when she learned her meal had been taken care of. Her smile widened, and clearly moved by the gesture, she turned her head quickly, scanning the room to identify the person who paid. I made sure to stay out of view and felt a quiet warmth in that moment, simply because of the joy on her face and the knowledge that I'd done something decent for someone who couldn't repay me. I wish that had been enough, said John. I wish simply knowing that I'd brought some goodness into the life of a stranger had been a fitting reward. But within a few moments, I began almost involuntarily carefully composing a social media post to document my good deed, along with a perfectly cropped, well-filtered photo of the scene. When the self-awareness of my pride kicked in, I felt sick to my stomach that I wanted both to be secretly kind and to broadcast my virtue so that others could applaud it. It was equal parts benevolence and self-promotion, and it was embarrassing to realize. I suppose that telling you this story is itself a self-inflating gesture, he added, but I'm rationalizing that I'm doing it as a teachable moment, so it doesn't count as a not-so-humble brag. It's hard to be humble, right? Pride is insidious. Amid the glory of Christmas, all the things we love about this season, all the joyousness in our songs, like today's song from the Psalms that exhorts all levels of creation to sing God's praises, from the angels in the heavens to the sun and moon to sea creatures and mountains and hills and animals and people. Amid all this exaltation, which is so much a part of Christmas, there is also a fundamental story of humility, of the heavenly Christ emptied of glory to take on human flesh and be born in a barn among animals. Christ born in a barn, said writer G.K. Chesterton, connects him to the world's humble outcasts. Christmas establishes humility as one of Christianity's most important virtues, to counter pride, which is one of humanity's most insidious faults. Christmas humility is found in today's gospel reading, where the Holy Family is forced to flee from Judea to Egypt to escape the murderous intentions of the tyrannical ruler Herod. Today, December 28th, on the church calendar, is the day we remember the so-called slaughter of the innocents in Bethlehem, when Herod ordered the deaths of babies in an attempt to wipe Jesus out. Today's gospel reading is the story we turn to when we say that Jesus was a migrant and a refugee, fleeing as so many in our world are forced to flee from oppressive regimes. It's an example of Christ experiencing what the world's most oppressed peoples experience. It's God humbled to the form of a refugee, fleeing political violence. It's God identifying fully with human suffering, which is what the incarnation, God made flesh, is. And it foreshadows the cross. God humbled turns humility into a virtue, something for us to seek. It makes humility divine. Today's gospel reading inspired churches this December to construct provocative nativity scenes to communicate the radical humility of Christ enfleshed, and to imagine what it would look like if Jesus were born today. One of those churches is Lake Street Church in Evanston, Illinois. Their nativity scene on the church property depicts Mary and Joseph wearing gas masks to protect against tear gas, and baby Jesus in a manger, not nestled in hay, but in a reflective blanket often used by immigrants in detention centers. Baby Jesus' hands are bound with zip ties, and 3 Roman centurions wearing ice vests loom nearby. Reverend Michael Wolf of Lake Street Church said of this scene, quote, "We know that Jesus was born into Roman imperial occupation and pretty much immediately became a refugee in Egypt, fleeing political violence. So we have to ask today, what would it look like if Jesus were born now?" Another church, St. Susanna Parish in Dedham, Massachusetts, created a similar nativity scene just outside their building. The scene has the typical wise men, shepherds, and stable animals of other nativity scenes, but the Holy Family is missing from the center. In their place is a sign that reads, "Ice was here." The fine print of the sign reads, "The Holy Family is safe inside the sanctuary of our church." Reverend Steve Jossima of St. Susanna Parish said that religious art should engage the viewer by pricking the heart. Then he quoted the late Pope Francis, who said, "If you want to meet God, you've got to go to the margins of life, the humblest places." Christmas is a story of glory, but it's also a story of humility. It can lift our spirits and fill us with joy, but it also reminds us that the Jesus we follow was humble, not in a groveling, waffling sort of way, but a confident humility that didn't need people's approval or its ego fed, a humility that enabled him to connect with all sorts of people, especially the humblest ones on the margins. When we clothe ourselves with humility, as the New Testament says, we're clothing ourselves with one of the most important virtues of our faith tradition. And we're reminding ourselves of one of the most basic meanings of Christmas, that humility is divine. Amen.